Hello everyone, and welcome to our Q&A industry panel, Conserve, Digitise, Curate and Preserve. My name is Roger Mills. I'm the Digital Preservation Consultant for Datacom IT, and I'm going to be chairing this discussion. Just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which each of our panel members are living and working, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Of course, I'd like to also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are actually with us today. Look, thank you so much for joining us. This is what's going to be a really engaging discussion, I think, with our panel of experts in the field of conservation, digitisation, curation and digital preservation. As cultural and historical heritage professionals, they have offered to share their knowledge and experiences on how to navigate the challenges and leverage the opportunities that these crucial fields offer. So it's really a unique opportunity for attendees to interact directly with these leading voices in the industry. And while some of you have already provided questions to date, for those of you who haven't yet, please feel free to ask questions through the Ask Questions window, or even just comment on what's being discussed if you like. And I'll pose those questions or statements to the panel members as we go through. Just like to say though, for anonymity reasons, we won't be revealing who's already sent us some of the questions unless otherwise instructed. But let me introduce and welcome our panel. Start with Detlev Luth, who is the Victorian Office State Manager for the National Archives of Australia. He is a professional photo and papers conservator with extensive experience as a preservation administrator, providing leadership in the development of the NAA's strategic preservation and digitisation plans, standards, policies and procedures. I'm afraid Julian Bickerstaff sends his apologies as he's unable to make the session today, but in his place is his esteemed colleague, Doug Rogan, Director, Museum and Gallery Services and ACT for the International Conservation Services, and has over 12 years of experience working for major museums, including the Natural History Collections at Auckland Museum and the Collection Manager for Canterbury Museum. Doug also has experience in collections handling and relocation, developing museum exhibitions and displays, and managing and running security for museum environments, including RFID technology for security and management of cultural collections. With us today as well is Robin Wright. Robin is Head Australasia and Asia Pacific for the Digital Preservation Coalition and has a background working in copyright and digital technologies. She was previously Manager Scholarly Resources at Swinburne University of Technology and Research Fellow at the Centre for Media and Communication Law at the University of Melbourne. We also have Adam Hodgkinson, who is the Business Manager for the audio-video digitisation company DamSmart. Adam has substantial experience in digitising time-based media assets, from solution development to project management and delivery, overseeing all phases of the project, ensuring they meet their objectives. His role really involves meticulous planning, coordination, and working with team specialists to ensure the highest possible standards of digitisation. We've also got Ian Charman, who's the General Manager of IAS Fine Art Logistics, with over 25 years of experience working in the logistics industry. Ian is responsible for the general management of domestic and international transportation, sales and marketing, and all operational components of the domestic business. Ian has managed numerous large-scale collection relocation projects, including the Australian Museum, the Australian Electoral Commission, and the National Archives of Australia. To my two Datacom IT colleagues, Eamon Donoghue, who's the General Manager of Datacom IT, and he's been involved in the establishing and managing and delivery of many large-scale and complex digitisation projects for government agencies and cultural institutions. Eamon is responsible for the digitisation and digital preservation strategies at Datacom IT, and has a deep understanding of where the industry presently sits and where it might evolve. And finally, Richard Wilson is the Business Development Manager at Datacom IT and has played a key role in the transformation of the business from data processing company to recognised leader in the provision of specialised digitisation services, solutions and equipment. Richard has a strong technical background in IT and works across all facets of Datacom IT's services with extensive experience and expertise with a range of specialised digitisation equipment, collection management software, which will come to the fore in our panel discussion. So everyone give a warm virtual welcome to our panel today. So thank you all for being here. Let's kick off the questions. Richard, this first question, what are the IT needs and considerations to network 4 and then 8 New South Wales community managed collections?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'm taking it from I guess the premise of the question asking how that can be networked is that collections or those collections in those 4 and 8 institutions are already digitised. Of course, if they're not, they would need to be. But ideally, being able to house those collections on a centralised web-based collection management or digital asset management system is going to be, I guess, what I believe is the best solution. In that each institution would still have their administrative capacity to upload, manage, curate their collection, but have it in one central repository that's then able to be accessed and shared. If, however, these institutions currently perhaps already have their assets in a system, an alternative to that could actually be producing a discovery layer or a federated discovery layer that is web-based again, that would have an interface to each of those disparate systems that they have. Probably being community-based, that's probably from a development perspective, maybe a little bit complex and cost prohibitive. But looking at the CMS type solutions or online hosted solutions, there are a range of suppliers that have entry-level solutions up to high-end solutions, of which Recollect is one that we obviously represent. But as an alternative to that, I know that you're based in New South Wales, but in Victoria there is a solution that's offered free of charge for community-based organisations called the Victorian Collections. I do apologise, I'm not aware, I'm based in Melbourne myself, not aware of a similar type offering in New South Wales, but it would certainly be worth reaching out to Victorian Collections as well to see if there is a similar counterpart in New South Wales that you could leverage. On the more basic option, if they've got those digital assets sitting on PCs or network drives, or worse even external hard drives, it would also be possible to have a single instance on Amazon Web Services, for example, as a online storage facility, and actually have a single repository that you could upload and store those collections in the one single spot, and of course manage them. That kind of solution wouldn't allow for the access and discovery if that was something that you were looking to do, but would provide some assurances that they're online, stored and backed up and accessible by each entity on their own.
Thanks, Richard. This is a bit of a follow-on question. I think it relates to that quite well, and point this to you, Adam. This question, our organisation has a physical AV collection and aims to preserve and use its content. What, in your opinion, is the most crucial consideration for getting a project like this underway?
Thanks, Roger. It's an interesting question. I think from my perspective, it's time is probably the most critical factor that sits with people who are looking to digitise AV archives, and that's largely due to the impact of technology obsolescence, particularly on our ability to continue delivering digitisation and preservation services for AV. I'm sure a lot of people know a few years ago the NFSA highlighted 2025 as a critical deadline for AV digitisation programs, mainly due to technology obsolescence, I guess different to the types of services that Datacom offer, where it's more paper-based. The AV formats themselves are proprietary. Each format requires a specific deck to play back that media. The devices for playback range in quality from consumer through to professional, and that can impact the results of the digitisation process. And decks, they stopped being manufactured 8 to 10 years ago. The Betacam and some of the Sony decks ceased to be manufactured, and there are no other decks being manufactured now. And similarly, the parts and equipment that is needed to maintain those decks is scarce and expensive. So the availability of equipment is really playing a big role. And that also follows on with things like skilled operators, the ability to actually operate this equipment. And importantly, you may have the decks and you may have the inventory of parts, but having the expertise, the engineers to maintain it is a problem. So that technology is really starting to play a heavy role. As the NFSA said, it was 2025 as being sort of the line in the sand. And really, we're starting to see that is there or thereabouts. So for anyone looking to digitise, AV media is something that's really important to sort of focus on, purely because you won't be able to access in a, I guess, affordable way as we stretch too far into the future.
Yeah, so Robin, okay, so an organisation has digitised their collection, be it AV or documents or so forth. This question kind of relates to this, and I think you'd be best to answer it. How can I assess my organisation's current digital preservation capability and compare it with other similar organisations? How do I explain to my managers that digital preservation isn't the same as digitisation or multi-location storage?
Thanks, Roger. Yes, that's fine. Well, for those of you who don't know, the Digital Preservation Coalition is a global community that's working together to bring about a sustainable future for digital assets. So part of what we do is we make available resources, and one of the resources that's quite useful if somebody wants to assess their organisation's capacity is the DPC RAM, our rapid assessment model, and that's freely available online. And that allows it's a maturity model that allows you to enable rapid benchmarking of your organisation's digital capacity and facilitate continuous improvement across your collection. So it allows you to self-analyse where you're up to under 11 categories. And I'll put a link to it into the website if anyone hasn't had a look at it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a link to the DPC RAM.
Yes.
So it includes a spreadsheet for recording and then visualising your results. So what it allows you to do is your self-assessment against the 11 capabilities, and those are divided into organisational capabilities and technical capabilities. And they are things like organisational viability, policy and strategy, legal and ethical considerations, your IT capacity, acquisition, transfer and ingest, bitstream preservation, content preservation, metadata management, and discovery and access. So you manage yourself, you look at what your current situation is in relation to all of those capabilities, and then it will output some information and graphs that you can use to speak to your management about it. So, and we have some other resources that'll help if you need to speak to management about those questions about why digital preservation is different, because obviously digital preservation is a series of activities. It's not just a single activity. And we publish resources such as the Executive Guide to Digital Preservation. So that gives you sort of messages and motivators that are designed to communicate with senior executives and people who are putting together budgets, that makes it clear why you need to do digital preservation. And we also have a business case toolkit and a preservation policy toolkit. So those allow you to contextualise your own situation and take that information forward to your management.
Yeah, you've certainly got some fantastic resources there in the DPC website, and I do recommend anyone just having a look at the website. And it really sort of, I guess, speaks to this question, because you do offer some training in this, although I'm going to pose this to Eamon in the first instance, and then maybe Doug might also talk to it. Really, what is the best way to support and teach community groups about digitisation and preservation? Eamon, do you want us to start with that one first?
Sure, thanks Roger, and thanks to whomever submitted that question. I think initially and often the best way to initiate programs with community groups is to facilitate regular engagement, maybe even sponsor a forum to share ideas and collaborate. And then once you've got that group together, there is a plethora of information that is freely available in the marketplace. The cultural institutions, Commonwealth and state, have lots and lots of information relating to digitisation and preservation, as do even university libraries and other groups. So I know the question did come from South Australia, and one site there is the History Trust of South Australia, which has some great information on digitisation lifecycle framework. Another way to engage with your community, I think, is to some of the tools that are out there, such as NLA's Trove or the National Archives Record Search or even Recollect, are great ways to demonstrate how the power of having digitised collection available for the public to engage in can make what was difficult to discover exciting and engaging. And then look, after that, I think for a more tailored solution, organisations such as ourselves offer training and consulting in this space. And now at Datacom IT, Roger, in fact, has developed a 6-module digital preservation training program with a module that's dedicated to digitisation as well. So there is plenty of information available out there, sometimes too much, but if you can get the community group engaging with each other for your own unique requirements, that's a great place to start.
And so, Doug, on the preservation side of this, let's take this into analogue preservation. Services?
Yeah, so there's nothing, just building on what Eamon was saying there's nothing quite like learning by doing, I've found, and working with small organisations to actually digitise their material and then to discuss with them the implications of what you've got to do with that digitised material and preserve that digitised material and then preserve the original material, which often places are already doing, but it's just giving a bit of guidance around better ways that can be done. But one of the things I've found in these sorts of projects, working with organisations, is actually helping people to navigate the standards required for digitisation, because that's something people are, if you like, oftentimes a little bit nervous about getting started and making sure that they're doing things the right way. And there's standards always improving, changing, and it's just being able to guide people about, these are the standards, this is how you digitise, this is the methodology, and then get them started. Away you go.
Detlef, what do the NAA offer in this space?
Well, I would just sort of add something further to Doug just now. I would add that it's important for the group, and we're talking about community groups, most likely volunteer groups who are wishing to digitise their holdings to make them more accessible in the first instance. But, in some cases, there may be preservation reasons to digitise holdings. So the AV collection that Adam was talking about, that's a good example where that would be, paramount to get that digitised as soon as possible from a preservation perspective, and of course, enhanced access. So community groups often don't really know what they've got, and I'm being terribly general by saying this, so excuse me on that side of things. But it's and then they need to be clearly sort of know why they're wanting to digitize, what's the end goal, and how they're going to manage that digital, not just the capturing, the digitization process, but then the management of that data. And of course, as Doug mentioned, the management of the analog record continues, and so you're really managing two parts of it. And one thing that I often point community groups to is that, have you already undertaken a significance assessment of your collection? Have you done a preservation needs assessment? And these are sort of core requirements that the National Library Community Heritage Grants require for you to actually get funding, say, from them to carry out the digitisation or other preservation matters to the holdings. So if you've got that in place, that gives you a good business case and a good clear path forward to what Doug was saying. Okay, we're going to digitise it to this standard for this reason, and we're going to manage that data in a certain way. And Robin already sort of highlighted, the management of data and others like Richard and so on. So I think that it's really having a good path and a clear vision of where this could go and needs to go. And yeah, I think, Doug, I imagine you would have those conversations with those groups, not just about the actual standards and so on. So certainly what we do, and we point them often to the National Library Community Heritage Grants, where they could get funding to carry out that sort of work.
Mm-hmm. So look, I mean, Adam, community groups, so there's limited resources, perhaps running on volunteers as well. How should an organisation approach prioritising materials for digitisation in this way?
Yeah, for us, I guess we use a matrix, or we suggest the use of a matrix as a starting point with 3 consideration factors, and that's around significance, format, and condition. Significance is obviously the value of the content to the organisation, and they can be looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is, I guess, the significance, the heritage value and that sort of thing, but also how is it going to be used by the community? So, we want to digitise to save, but we also want to digitise to engage with the community and let people have access to that. So what does the community want to use and access? So the significance, and I will just touch on one point here, which sort of sets us aside from static media, is having an understanding of what is on magnetic media can be challenging for organisations, particularly with community groups and smaller organisations where they've acquired content from a range of places without actually knowing what's on it. You need the equipment to play it back. And so there is no way with magnetic media, a piece of paper you can look at and make a judgment call. To a certain degree, motion picture film, you can put up to light and make a bit of a judgment call. But it is important to acknowledge that with magnetic media, you don't know what it is until you play it back, unless you've got it catalogued. And unfortunately, as I sort of touched on before with technology obsolescence, we're very limited in our ability to play back that content for people to audition it. We look more just digitise. Otherwise, it's head hours that are being used on that sort of scarce equipment to make a decision as to whether you want to keep or not. And a lot of the processes are going to be the same, whether you just look or whether you look and digitise at the same time. Again, touching back on technology obsolescence, another consideration is format. We're going back to something like 2-inch, which was released in 1956. It was the original format, through to Betacam, which stopped manufacturing in around 2016. Generally speaking, the older or the further back you go, the harder it is to recover, the less equipment it is, the more expensive that those processes can be to recover. And the third consideration there is condition. If you've got a collection that's in perfect condition, you've got those other 2 criteria to select against. But then if you find parts of the collection which are mouldy, or you've got vinegar syndrome in the film, that's an important factor as well, because, technology obsolescence is obviously a big problem. There is still that condition issue. If the tape's mouldy, can it be conserved? Can the signal be recovered off magnetic media? Is the film too far gone to jump on a scanner, or is it heading in that direction? So for us, we sort of, as I said, suggest a matrix with 3 considerations: significance, format, and condition.
Yeah. Detlef, limited resources again here. What would you say are some of the best practices and strategies for implementing digital preservation in a National Archive sense with limited resources? The questioner here references the Vanuatu National Archives. How can similar institutions effectively balance the need for digitisation with the constraints in budget and technical expertise that they might have or have not?
Look, it's certainly a challenge for whether you're in the South Pacific or whether you're in remote Australia or just a small community group with very few resources, even in capital cities. So I think what I would often say is just do your best to physically look after the analog record in the first instance, and digitisation is sort of the next layer of what can be achieved, what can be to preserve, to make accessible those holdings. But the analog record in Vanuatu, I think that the National Archive Library there still gets plenty of customers through the doors, and I'm sure that they would also come through the web. But that there's work to be done there to make the web more accessible to those holdings, not just to digitize those holdings, but make that more accessible to the community. So if the collection is ready for digitization, that's already a lot of the work done, and then also prioritizing what you want to digitize is I think a long way towards getting your collection digitized. But I would also look to suggest that you partner with other organisations, whether they're local or in country or out of the country. And I think that there are some opportunities there for the Vanuatu National Archive.
That's right, yeah.
And Library. So partnership in digitisation, particularly when it comes to storage of that data. I think a lot of those South Pacific islands do struggle with that, and I would think digitisation is an issue, but I think it's more of an issue to work out where are your priorities, and why are you digitising that, and is the collection all kind of safe and ready to be digitised?
Mm-hmm. Doug, sorry, you're going to...
I was just going to say, and also thinking about, are you in a position to maintain it afterwards? Yeah. So thinking about the ongoing digital preservation and the costs that are going to apply in that situation. Are people aware of and have a plan for that once you've digitised things?
That's right. That's right.
And that's all part of those, what you were talking about earlier, right, Robin, in terms of your organisational preparedness to undertake something like this.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Doug, it's a question for you, and it really follows on from this too. Do documents need conservation before digitisation? Does the process risk damage to documents?
Well, I mean, all collections need some sort of assessment before they're digitised in some way, shape or form, whether that's a conservation or just a condition assessment to make sure that the documents are stable and suitable for digitisation. And then you've got to look at the potential digitisation processes out of the back of that. So you might have very fragile documents, for example, that might be stable, might not have any rips or tears, but you wouldn't necessarily put them through an automated digitisation process. But at the other end, you could have, typed documents that are very stable, A4 sheets of paper in a file that are perfectly stable and suitable for going through a much faster and more efficient automated process. And it comes down to assessing the collection before you do anything. And a lot of the assessment can be a physical assessment of the whole collection. Is what needs to be done. Is there are there repairs needed to torn, folded edges of paper, staples need removing, paper clips, simple things like that. But then it can also look at, in some cases you could have issues with light exposure, and you might need to consider that. That's less of an issue because it's often the digitisation process is ideally a one-off, and that gets around that. But those are some of those things. And then then there's also looking at not documents, but like 3D objects. You got to look at the stability and potentially cleaning and dust and that sort of stuff before they're photographed. But oftentimes these things come down to it.
Roger, could I add to that?
Sure, let's go for it. If Doug's finished.
Sorry, Doug, I didn't mean to interject there. I just wanted to add to what you were saying, and I think that you hit it on the nail. But I would just the approach that I often take when we're looking at a collection and saying, well, what is the assessment? The physical assessment, is it, what condition is it in? But what is the most appropriate digitising equipment process for that type of material? And I know that for Richard and Eamon, they often also say, what's the most efficient way to get this through the project? But for us, it's about what's the most appropriate to safeguard that particular item while it's going through that digitising process. And light, of course, is one of those, and the condition, is another one. But if the condition is poor, then we just look to a different way to digitise it. And I think that, and preparation is a big part of it, as in it might require some, prep work, treatment work before it actually gets digitised to make it safe, but also to get the best quality result, and I feel that often is a little bit undervalued, but sitting down with the digitising staff and the other colleagues that that have that expertise in the technical equipment and software and so on, and working together on a suitable solution to that particular item or to that set of records is really rewarding, because we always come up with a good solution that minimises the risk in the process.
Yeah, good point. I might just add here that Jill Rogers from ALIA has just posted in the chat that people from national GLAM organisations, community groups are welcome to join without a membership fee the ALIA Digitisation and Preservation Group, which includes webinars, events, resources sharing. Some council libraries have digitisation equipment and staff to help, and she's put some resources, some links there as well. But listen, following on from what you're just talking about there, Detlev, and this is something I've often wondered: what do you do with Moldy Records? I mean, how do you can you digitize Moldy Records?
Well, they're not fun, but I suspect most institutions have some form of Moldy Records. Look, I believe you can digitize them, but there's a lot of proviso that goes with that. From when we, in the National Archive, we've got paper records that can be moldy, and we ensure that mold gets, well, first of all, as we discussed earlier, that the record gets assessed first, and then we discover it's moldy. Then we look to treat that and sterilize and remove as much of those mold spores and ensure that it's not active mold, of course, as well. So that's quite a professional sort of different bit of activities, and in some cases we've even used third parties to help us with that. But once it's sort of treated, we still classify it as a hazardous record, and so we would scan it if it's stable enough. That is, if the record still shows some form of information, then we'd still look to digitize that record, because we know that through that digital copy, it's really the only way that someone can use that information that those records contain. We are not going to make available that even though it's treated that moldy record after digitization or before digitization, it's a risk that we're not prepared for our clients or our staff to have. So the scanner, the operator that carries out the scanning, then has to have all of the protective gear. Even though the item might have been treated already, we pretend as if it is still dangerous, and we would look to scan sometimes even when there's nothing noticeable still there, because we can show evidence that we haven't doctored it. In our case, we haven't removed any information. There is simply no information left, and sometimes that for evidence base, that's important to even show that page with completely moldy damage and loss of information. So it requires professional assistance up front, and then close discussion with the digitizing operator, whether it's a third party or it's in-house. You want to make sure you have the protective equipment to carry that out. And there are some instructions on that on the web. Actually, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that we have detailed instructions on that on our own website, but I'm sure that we can send you something if that's what you're after.
Can I just add to that, Detlev and Roger, from a audio-visual perspective, and I guess when you're talking to community groups and that type of thing, when it comes to magnetic media in particular, it's not always evident that there is some sort of degradation to the format, such as sticky shed, where you've got in the simplest form, the tape's basically sticking to each other, and then someone goes and puts it in a deck and or a sticky shed syndrome, where your binder's starting to stop working in the recording service and the backing no longer hold up, and so they put it into a machine to audition it, and suddenly you lost all that content because it can't be recovered. So it's an important consideration, particularly with magnetic media, that just because it looks okay doesn't mean that it's always okay just to stick in a machine. So having an understanding of what those conditions are and how they can affect and how you can recognise them is important, particularly when less experienced organisations are trying to either audition or digitise tapes as they move through their collection.
In, when companies or organizations are wanting to transport these very vulnerable documents and tape or film or whatever it is, what in your mind should they be thinking about in terms of transporting materials for digitisation if they're if they get their funding and they've got a digitisation project? What are the main things they should be thinking about there?
I think my initial thought is try to engage with your logistics provider as soon as you can throughout the
It's a little bit frozen there by looks of things.
I'm sorry?
Am I back?
Is Ian a bit frozen?
I can hear you.
As I said, I'd engage with your logistics provider as soon as you can, as early as possible in the process, as we're still an important consideration, and even through the funding application phase. We would certainly consult with the client and review the program with them, looking at the quantities, the sizes, the types, and also the duration of the program. And during those discussions, history would say that we're able to offer good suggestions, implement efficiency gains, and also then provide cost-effective solutions. And then we're able to provide a budget for all of that, so that can also be included from day one. During those discussions, we're discussing the preparation and the packing requirements for each of the collection items, and then the potential cost implications for those considerations as well. And then also what sort of climate conditions are the objects to be moved in between locations.
I was going to say that. I mean, really delicate materials, right? So I'm trying to imagine you transporting items in high humidity or hot weather or pouring with rain. How what are your vehicles like? I mean,
we've got museum quality climate controlled vehicles, and they run at a standard setting of 21 degrees Celsius and 50% relative humidity. But that can be adjusted on a needs basis. If the temperature needs to be lowered, then we can just dial them back.
Good, thank you so much, Richard. This is actually stated her name. She doesn't mind being mentioned here. So Pauline Ragat from Matheson Library at PNG University Technology. The Matheson Library newly established a digitisation section. What would be the best recommended setup? And she's talking about software, hardware, equipment, room setting for a digitisation section.
All right. There's certainly a lot to cover there, and probably more time would be needed than I can apply to it today. So probably the main thing that it's worth talking about today is assessing your collection and the type of material that you've got, to then be able to to align that with a device that could be used to capture and digitise the vast majority of it. So some of the factors that you should look at is obviously the type of material in terms of its size. So most proprietary scanners will market a product based on an A3, A2, A1, A0. And similarly, you'll find with camera stand or copy stand type setups having a camera and what size it will capture. So I think going through your collection, identifying the size of the material, and then also whether it is bound or it's loose or single sheet. And if it is bound, as to whether that that item is able to be opened at 180 degrees for digitisation, or whether it needs a cradle at 45 degrees or a 90 degree angle. And then once you've been able to make that assessment of your collection, and you'll be able to see, I guess, where the majority of the material fit in terms of that size, coupling that then with the specification that you're wanting to digitise that material at, you'll then be able to work out, well, if I purchase an A2 device with a compensating book cradle and a 90 degree book cradle as well, I'll be able to capture 80% of my collection with that device. You could, of course, scale it up and get the biggest possible scanner, A1 or A0, but obviously the cost of those items start to get bigger and higher. And so identifying what you could achieve the larger portion of your collection with is going to ultimately help and enable you to pick the right device.
Just note a statement here from Andrew Hales. He says, worth noting that most camera-based digitisation setups will use LED or studio flash, most of which is zero UV, Broncolor, Profoto, etc., and LED constant studio lights. So I guess that is worth considering into the mix as well. Doug, this is a question from Jenny V at AETSIS. She says, the Australian Institute for the Conservation of Cultural Materials, AICCM, has a webpage on audiovisual and digital, stating that audiovisual conservation encompasses media recorded on motion picture film, magnetic media, audio-video recording technologies, and video. The main focus, though, seems to be on the physical carrier, where transfer of the digital material would be a treatment if the carrier has deteriorated or become obsolete. But what about the conservation of the digital files themselves? Do you think we could bring digital preservation processes into the conservation realm for digital files? For example, when assessing the digital health of digital content received and transferred into a collecting institution, e.g. conducting virus checks, checksums, identifying digital objects, what's in obsolete formats, what's potentially corrupt or encrypted, which require passwords. What are your thoughts there?
I think in terms of a broader focus on the conservation profession, it's probably related to the age of conservators, generally speaking, and the newer conservators are totally across this element. I think that's the evidence in that is the number of, for example, time-based media conservators that we're seeing being employed at art galleries around Australia. Probably even 5 years ago there was one or two.
Of course, we got one on this panel, right, with Adam.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. But there's several at Art Gallery New South Wales. There's some at National Gallery of Australia, and they're very recent things. So I think the conservation profession is starting to take this seriously, and that will slowly permeate up, if you like, into AICCM and be taught in courses and etc. I mean, it is absolutely and utterly a central part of the conservation of our heritage fabric. The digital world is the world we live in now. There's no two ways about it, and conserving the digital asset is as much a conservation activity as conserving the Elgin marbles, things like that. Whereas it's slightly different, I suppose, from the historical conservation profession, is that previously conservators were given the responsibility to conserve an object or a collection or an item, whereas now with digital assets it's much more of a collaborative process whereby you've essentially got the conservators, the collection managers and the IT department, for example, and registrars all needing to work together to actually develop the digital preservation policies and procedures and ensure all of those aspects, like checksums and assessing the digital objects and making sure that all the digital preservation activities are actually in place and managed. And it's not purely the responsibility of a conservator. And of many places, it isn't actually. It's much more of a registrar's responsibility, or to a lesser extent, an IT manager, IT person's. But that's the picture I've seen.
Adam, I mean, you've probably got something to say here.
I was just going to add to that.
Yeah, go on.
That we've done work with Art Gallery New South Wales, and plus the National Gallery of Singapore, a range of other galleries working to preserve physical time-based media assets, but also born digital content. So artworks that are commissioned and delivered on hard drives, or going back to the old CDs and optical media that used to be the delivery medium for digital content. And at the moment, I guess maybe it's a bit of a transition space where we're working with organisations who have time-based conservators starting to come in-house and starting to develop policies, but still not having the infrastructure and the processes in place to do it in-house. So we're assisting with getting those artworks, both physical and born digital, into a format that can then be brought back into the organisation, the gallery, or whatever it may be. So we're using delivery methods like incorporation of Bagot from a preservation perspective as one example, and then delivering that back on multiple formats for redundancy and various other practices to help and assist those organisations are still developing those internal skills around management and conservation of digital assets.
I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier to a degree as well, but does the digitisation process of film risk damage to the media?
Yeah, but I guess magnetic media in particular, like you've only got one shot at it left. It's an expensive process to go through, and B, as we spoke to earlier, technology obsolescence is going to limit your ability in the future to go to it. So, based on our experience, if we are coming across collections or collection items that are suffering from some form of degradation or physical damage, we'll make an assessment of that object and then consult with the collection owner or custodian about what can be done to conserve the physical object prior to digitisation or migration. And quite often it comes down to, yes, there's a risk that that damaged or degraded item the object itself may be damaged in the transfer process, but the other option is you don't digitize it and it no longer becomes accessible. So particularly in a time-based context, it may be a different consideration there when your only other option is just to hold on to a VHS tape, for example, where the object may mean something to you, but the actual value sits on the content and that's locked up if you don't do something about it.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, again, transporting magnetic tape, I mean, do you put in place different measures for different types of media that you transport?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in our role as custodians, then really the care and protection of the items that we transport commences from the time that we're initially involved in the project. We know that any time that a collection item is moved, it's subject to some form of deterioration. So we just pose the question: how do we best protect any object that we're going to be moved and whilst it's in our care? And that's done through consultation with the client and also conservation as well. We've discussed, we talked before about the preparation and packing, so we sort of hone in on there and what's the best and most suitable moving capture for the item to be transported in. Whether that's an archive carton or a crate or a travel frame, or is there a specialist packing requirement that's required, a bespoke solution. And then once the items are packed, then we sort of look at okay, what's the best moving device for that to be moved from its current location and into our vehicle. So we've got a standard range of moving devices that assist with that process of a transit crate that it's good for boxed items or 2 or 3D works. We also have a product called a museum cart where objects can actually nestle into a sort of a beanbag type arrangement. Or we can sort of manufacture bespoke solutions to assist with that. We've spoken about the climate control conditions that might be required in the vehicle. But also when we're talking about protecting items, we're also protecting them against loss as well. So what's the level of inventory management is required during the moving process, that chain of custody, how robust is that? And then all of these discussions are taking place and activities occur before you're actually loading anything into the vehicle. So it's important to have the right vehicle, air ride suspension, hydraulic tail lifts, extra large hydraulic tail lifts that assist with the safe and the ease of the moving in and out of the vehicle. And then you look at the security of the actual vehicle itself. Our vehicles travel on preset transportation routes, and those routes are monitored via GPS, and that could also include geofencing if required. Our trucks are all fully lockable, but also the cargo holds are covered under CCTV surveillance, so that the driver can view the cargo hold of his vehicle whilst he's driving. And then the cargo hold can also be security sealed if required, so that offers tamper-free evidence at the point of destination. And also we can employ, security escorts to go along with the vehicle as well. So that's all about, protecting the item. Other measures that we have in place is, we don't subcontract out any works. All of the work we do in Australia is by our own staff and our own vehicles. All of our staff are fully trained. We have a national training program in place, and also that, all of our staff are national police checked before they commence. So, we treat it pretty seriously, as all the other service providers do. So that's basically how we go about protecting the items under our care.
Thanks for that, Ian. Robin, this is a data sovereignty question, moving a little bit away from what we've just been talking about. This question really is about how third-party service providers guarantee that GLAM organisations can retain security, control and sovereignty of the data in the short term, and more importantly in the longer term. It's talking about 50 to 100 years here. So the example is, museums and archives strive to care for their collections such as that they exist beyond the people doing the work. And they say there's caretakers before us and there will be caretakers after us, but the collection will always be. How can a commercial organisation operate in the same way when profit is what drives them? And I'm glad I've given that to you rather than any of the commercial organisations on the panel.
Thanks, Roger. Yes, that's an issue, obviously, that the DPC is very aware of. It's very difficult in our world as it is even at the moment, let alone how it's going to be in 50, 100, 200 years' time, to say that a third-party service provider can guarantee ongoing access. But really, this is why digital preservation is a broad issue that has to be dealt with by your whole organisation, and why, you have to be able to convince, as we said, IT managers and others, management of your organisation, that digital preservation is important and needs to be built into the policies and strategies that your organisation is going to employ on an ongoing basis. So, this is something that the DPC is very aware of. And in fact, we're looking at putting together an event on future thinking for digital preservation, which we're going to be running in November in both the UK and Australasia, and talking to, at the moment, there's the Chief Research Officer at the Institute of Physics who's just written a book called After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory. That's quite interesting, and he's going to be speaking at that. And I'm hoping that here in Australia we'll also address the really important issue of Indigenous data sovereignty, and have some speakers who can talk to us about the methodologies and the processes in place for dealing with deep time preservation, and which is something that's come out of the Indigenous people in Australia and the Maori community in New Zealand. So we're very keen to make sure those discussions are put into the global discussion around long-term digital preservation.
And if anyone who's attending today want to join those sessions, how do they do that?
Have a look on the DPC website. We've got an events tab at the top of our website, and that'll bring up information about all the events. The November events won't be up yet, but they'll be there soon. So yes, the Future Thinking event will be in November this year.
Okay, that's really good advice. This question is taking another slightly different track altogether. Eamon, I think this is probably best answered by you. What is the difference between the many standards and guidelines in the industry? For instance, the ISO standards, VAGI, NAA, etc. Authentication of digital product from analog. It's from the National Archive of the Republic of Indonesia, interestingly enough.
Okay, thanks, Roger. It's quite a broad question, I guess, in that there are many standards at international level, as well as those that only apply to particular groups or even to particular materials. So I think the standards that apply will depend often on the type of material to be digitised, the intention you have for the records, which is really important, and any compliance that's required. I think for many collections housed at cultural institutions, there is a need to digitise to a very high standard. Often the records, digital records, need to be kept for very long periods of time, and even with some in perpetuity. So a high quality digitised output can be the first and often most crucial step towards digital preservation. So it's something that needs to be considered when commencing any project. I think in Australia, the National Archives and other cultural agencies have developed standards and guidelines. It's worth noting that a lot of those Australian standards and guidelines have, for want of a better term, cherry-picked many of the international guidelines. So they've taken bits and pieces from FADGI and Metamorphosis, ISI guidelines, etc., as well as applied what is unique to the Australian environment. I think it's worth noting that there is a lot of terminology out there. Things like FADGI and Metamorphosis primarily relate to colour replication, and they apply a science to colour, and in large part demonstrate that the eye is not good enough to be able to distinguish between colours once replicated. So that's very interesting once you get down that rabbit hole, but not worth doing now. So most of our clients in Australia, the specifications are largely based on the National Archives guidelines and specification, often small variations to suit internal needs and systems. So things like compression, file formats, archival master files versus derivatives, etc. They can be things that are more personal to the organisation or to the system where these elements are going to live. At Datacom IT, we digitise to all standards, and I think Adam, this is probably pretty similar in the AV arena. So yeah, it's worth spending some time at the start of a project, doing a little bit of research. However, in Australia in particular, I know this question comes from Indonesia, but the Australian standards are very high, and I don't think you would do any disservice by using the National Archives as a base standard there, especially given the comments I made just a little while ago regarding how critical the digitisation element can be to digital preservation.
I'm just aware of time here now, panel. Are we all okay to carry on? We've got a few questions more to get through. Richard, have you got any ideas here?
Look, I think I'm certainly available, and of course our attendees, we understand we advertise as only being here for the hour, so we understand you may have to leave, but I guess we've got a couple of other questions there that we haven't got to. We'll go for another 5 or 10 minutes or so and see if we can knock them over.
All right. Well, I might just jump straight back to you, Robin, if that's okay. This is from Jenny V at AETSIS again. And she's been saying she's been seeking resources to simply explain the relationship in Australian copyright law for lawful provision of access to digitised versus born digital objects. She says, but I'm still confused. Here's the scenario. A collection organisation acquires a new collection which contains a hybrid mix of analogue and digital materials. There is a born digital file, a Word document of some unpublished notes that the creator or donor has made. The collection also contains a hard copy print of the Word document, including handwritten annotations by the creator. The receiving archive digitises the analogue hard copy PDF and also accepts the born digital Word file into the collection archive. An external client requests access to both representations and the notes, e.g. the digitized file and the born digital file. How should the collecting institution provide access to A and B? Is there a difference between digitized and born digital versions in copyright law? Over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Roger. Well, sorry you're confused, Jenny. Since the Digital Agenda reforms to the Australian Copyright Act in 2000, no, there's no difference between digitised and born digital content. So both of them have copyright. Copyright protects both those items equally. So you just need to be clear how you're making the material available under copyright law. Both those pieces, those works that you're talking about, will be covered by the same copyright. Of course, there'll be additional copyright for the handwritten material because that's different to the original material. The text is different. But what matters is what provisions of the Copyright Act you're using to copy the material, to digitise it, which is a reproduction, and then to make it available to your users. So you need to have some understanding of the Copyright Act. And I'm sure you're doing that already in your organisation. It's the same for digital material as for non-digital material in many cases. I would suggest you look at some of the resources available from the Australian Copyright Council. They have fantastic, freely available fact sheets that give you information about, the provisions of the Act that you can use to preserve and make material available. And they've got a good one, I just looked it up today, on Galleries and Museums Introduction to Copyright. And that gives you some information about how you can digitise and make material available under certain sections of the Act. And there's one for libraries as well. So I suggest you go and have a look at the Australian Copyright Council resources.
Thank you. Very succinctly put. That's great, Robin. Thanks. I'm going to open this up to the entire panel, but please speak up, whoever would like to answer it. It's from Andrew from the Maritime Museum of New Zealand. It's put ourselves in the situation. It's 2044. Third-party supplier of data storage or preservation repositories under different ownership and different management. They've grown comfortable and complacent. Let's say the Nokia of the South Pacific. New technology revolutionises how data is stored and managed, and third-party supplier goes bankrupt in a matter of months. What happens to our data?
Look,
Anyone
I guess
I'll step into this one?
I'll jump in there, Roger, unless somebody else wanted to take first go. It is obviously a very doomsday scenario. But I guess having worked with several SaaS solutions where this data is hosted online, those providers are not, I guess, the owners are responsible for the management of that data just for the system that they're providing. And I guess it comes back to the original, the custodians or the owner, collection manager, to also be, ahead and aware of changes in the industry and identifying that their service provider is keeping up with the times. And of course, if they're not, to have good governance in their strategies to look into change before that eventuates. Obviously, that scenario is very much a doomsday one, but hopefully with good governance that organisations can foresee or to actually have planning and structures in place to identify these types of risks and issues and address them before they occur.
Just on following on from what Richard said, is just when you're sort of contracting a third-party supplier, is to see if they've got a data escrow system in place, which essentially puts their source code into a independent third party that, assuming they stay available, means that you can get source code to that system to access if you need that to access your data. But ideally, your data is kept independently and accessible. Sorry, Robin.
No, that's right. Good. Thanks, Doug. I was going to say the same, really, say that what matters is you have good contracts in place that you are aware of and you test the ongoing viability of. But someone said also something you have to be sure when you know up front is you have a system to get your data out. You always know how you're going to get your data out, whatever happens. And you have that in your plans and in your contractual relationships with all your third-party providers, because you need to know that up front, because you never know what's going to happen in the future.
Good advice.
And I think, like someone said right at the very beginning, most cultural institutions have even if their cloud-based data storage is still stored on Australian soil, I think.
Anybody else before we move on to this last question?
I think just adding that the cloud providers, and everyone's going cloud these days for reasons of security and for the less carbon footprint. The AWS and Azure, you've got organisations like Defence storing $2 billion worth of sensitive data there. So the credentials and the bank data is all there. The credentials are there, and majority of the SaaS systems, definitely that we support, are using either one of those two for data storage.
Roger, I would probably just add one more thing, and that's probably my
I was hoping you would, Dan. I think it should be our answer.
It's just like, to me, what that highlights is that your organisation is got a partnership with a third party, and that partnership doesn't just, you just don't give the data over and thank you, see you later. It's an ongoing relationship. So nothing should come as a surprise. If they're going out of business, that shouldn't be on, tomorrow's 9 o'clock news to you. You should already know that last week that they're going out of business. It's something that you should be working closely to ensure perhaps even they don't go out of business, and that you do have a plan B and so on. And that goes to storage as well for analog records. Some collecting institutions rent storage space for other facilities that they're not owned by them. So you need to know what that business is like and whether you can trust them and continue to work with them ongoing. And so it's a partnership, it's a relationship building exercise at all times, I would think.
Yeah, good point. All right, I'm just looking at some of the questions that we've got in the, or not questions, but statements as well. Can you recommend a digital management system for those of us on low budgets and low IT support situations? From David Parker. We probably hear you from this panel.
Yeah, I think we did make some references there. Obviously, for Victorian-based institutions, community, there is that option. But of course, someone has then noted, of course, that's not available outside of Victoria. And I think in those comments as well, Roger, has been some other recommendations to the Museums and Galleries Association.
There are a few online collection databases, whether they do the job of digitalisation, so like collect, free-ish, if you like Collective Access and eHive and various other things that have a small, I think cost-free for a very small number of records and things like that. They're not quite so much a DAMS, which might be what he's after.
And I guess, Roger, there is also, Preservica, which does have, a free introductory offer to store and host starter online as well.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we might leave it here, and let's thank our panel. Thank you so much for all of your input today. It's been a really stimulating discussion, and I think everyone's got a lot out of it. So we'll close now, and just big virtual applause to you all.
You all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Right. Bye now.